Everyone was watching when the envelope slid across the restaurant table. My husband didn't look at me. His mother smiled too politely. The waiter hovered, pretending not to hear. Inside was a check and a prepared divorce agreement. $100,000 to disappear quietly. After 2 years of tests, injections, silence, they had already replaced me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I signed while my hands stayed steady. Phones buzzed around us. Plates clinked. No one stopped it. I stood, thanked them, and walked out alone. 3 weeks later, while they planned a wedding and 3 cribs, news. I left the country 2 days after the papers were finalized. I told no one where I was going. Not my friends. Not my sister. I booked a one-way ticket, packed only what fit in a carry-on, and closed the door on the apartment that had never really been mine. The money hit my account the morning I landed. I checked the balance once, then put the phone away. What stayed with me wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how efficiently it happened. How calmly everyone moved around me as if my removal was a scheduled task. My husband's family had always been polite, never warm. They spoke in practical terms. Doctors. Timelines. Legacy. When the tests kept coming back inconclusive, their tone changed. Conversations stopped including me. Decisions happened elsewhere. The first time I heard about the mistress, it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. My husband told me in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. He said it like he was late for a meeting. She was pregnant. Not just pregnant. Expecting triplets. The words hung there, heavy and unreal. I remember staring at the steam on the cabinets and thinking about how quiet the house sounded. After that, everything accelerated. His parents flew in. Lawyers appeared. I was asked what I wanted, but the question was ceremonial. The real plan was already drafted. They needed a clean break. No delays. No scenes. The offer came framed as generosity. Enough money to start over. Enough to make me reasonable. When I hesitated, his mother reminded me of the years they had waited. Of the money they had spent on treatments. Of how unfair it would be to complicate things now. She spoke softly, like she was consoling me. My husband stayed silent. He nodded when she talked about the future. He didn't once look at me. That night, I slept on the couch. In the morning, I found a folder on the dining table. Tabs. Sticky notes. A checklist. Someone had already marked the items they were responsible for. I was listed under documents. That was the moment something in me settled. Not anger. Clarity. I asked for one change. A clause confirming the payment was unconditional and final. No confidentiality penalties tied to future events. The lawyer paused, surprised, then agreed. His pen scratched across the page. No one questioned why I wanted it. They were too focused on moving forward. At the restaurant, when I signed, my husband's father pushed the check toward me with 2 fingers, like it might stain him. He said this was the best outcome for everyone. His voice carried just enough to be heard by the nearby tables. People glanced over, curious, then looked away. No one intervened. No one asked if I was okay. I took the envelope and stood up. I didn't make a speech. I didn't ask questions. I said thank you, because it was the fastest way out. In the car, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. I felt hollow, but steady. On the flight, I watched clouds move under the wing and thought about how quickly a life could be reassigned. I opened a new email account. I scanned every document I had signed and saved copies in 3 places. I requested my medical records. All of them. Full reports. Lab results. Dates. It wasn't revenge. It was instinct. When something ends that cleanly, it usually means someone is hiding a mess they think won't reach you. The country I landed in was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No one knew me there. I rented a small apartment near a market and took long walks at night when the streets emptied. During the day, I worked remotely, answering emails that had nothing to do with my past. At first, the distance felt like relief. Then it started to feel like cover. I organized my files the way I always had when things felt unstable. Dates first. Then names. Then versions. My medical records arrived in batches. Some were scanned cleanly. Others looked rushed, as if someone had copied them in a hurry. I noticed gaps. Appointments that were referenced but not included. Lab numbers without summaries. I emailed the clinic that had handled most of my treatment and asked for complete records. They replied with a form letter. Processing time. Privacy review. I waited. While I did, messages from my husband's family started appearing, short and oddly cheerful. Photos of venue visits. Questions about addresses for final paperwork. I didn't respond. When the second batch of records arrived, a pattern began to form. The timelines didn't match what I remembered being told. Tests marked inconclusive were followed by notes suggesting further evaluation that never happened. One report referenced a consult I was never scheduled for. Another listed a diagnosis code that had been explained to me as definitive. I asked a local physician, someone I'd met through work, to look over the files. Not for treatment. Just to help me understand them. He read quietly, flipping pages without comment. When he reached the end, he asked if I was sure these were complete. I said they were everything I'd been given. He pointed to a section and said, very carefully, that some conclusions seemed premature. That certain results usually triggered follow-up testing. That the absence of those tests was unusual. He didn't speculate. He didn't offer theories. He just suggested I request the raw lab data. That night, I slept poorly. In the morning, I sent another email. This time, I asked for original lab outputs, not summaries. I cited dates. Accession numbers. I used neutral language. The response took longer. While I waited, news reached me through mutual acquaintances. The pregnancy was being announced publicly. Interviews were scheduled. There was talk of a ceremony, carefully timed. The narrative was clean. Tragic first marriage. Miraculous second chance. Everyone spoke as if the past had already been archived. The raw data arrived in a compressed file. I printed it all and spread it across the table. There it was, quiet but undeniable. Values that fell within ranges I'd been told were impossible. Notes appended weeks later, after decisions had already been made. Someone had interpreted ambiguity as certainty, and no one had corrected it. I didn't call my husband. I didn't confront his parents. I made copies. I highlighted inconsistencies. I created a timeline that showed when conclusions were reached and when evidence actually supported them. It was methodical work. It kept me calm. A week later, an email arrived from a private lab in another state. A routine notification. They were confirming receipt of a sample associated with a case number I recognized. It wasn't mine. It was recent. I checked the date. It was after the divorce. After the announcement. I replied, asking if the notification had been sent in error. They apologized and said the account email must not have been updated. They asked me to confirm removal. Before I did, I saved the message. That was when I understood this hadn't been a sudden change of heart. It was a process. A plan. And plans leave trails, even when people think you're too far away to follow them. The boundary was crossed the day I realized they had made decisions about my body without me in the room. It wasn't just emotional. It was procedural. Someone had authorized interpretations and next steps as if I were an obstacle to be managed, not a person involved. I requested a certified copy of every consent form tied to my treatment. The clinic responded defensively this time. They asked why I needed them. I said it was for my records. That answer was still true. One form stood out. My signature was there, but the date wasn't. The timestamp showed it had been logged after a consultation I never attended. I compared it to emails from that week. Travel receipts. Calendar entries. I hadn't even been in the city. I contacted the clinic again, calmly, attaching the discrepancies. I asked them to confirm how that form had been executed. The reply came from legal, not administration. They said they were reviewing the matter internally. At the same time, messages from my former in-laws intensified. They wanted confirmation I wouldn't contest anything. They wanted reassurance. My husband emailed once, late at night, asking if I was okay. I didn't answer. I hired an attorney in the country I was in, someone with no connection to them. I sent him everything. He didn't react immediately. He read. Then he asked for one thing. Proof of reliance. How had these conclusions been used? I forwarded the divorce agreement. The timing. The offer. The language about moving forward based on medical certainty. He nodded once and said that was enough to begin. The lab notification became important then. The sample linked to the case number belonged to the mistress. The testing was confirmatory. It contradicted the public story. I requested, through counsel, confirmation of whose consent was attached to that case. The answer arrived in writing. The consent bore my name. That was the moment I stopped feeling displaced and started feeling documented. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was substitution. They had used my established patient profile to fast-track testing, to control timing, to eliminate delays. It saved them weeks. It saved them scrutiny. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to accuse. I filed a formal complaint with the medical board. I attached exhibits. I included timelines. I submitted everything through my attorney so it entered the system cleanly. 3 days later, my husband's family called. Not to threaten. To ask what I wanted. They spoke carefully now. The wedding was approaching. There were investors. Appearances. I told them I wanted nothing. I told them I had already submitted what mattered. Silence followed. Then panic, thinly disguised as concern. They asked if we could talk privately. I declined. The clinic suspended 2 staff members pending review. The board opened an inquiry. The lab froze the contested case. None of this was public yet, but it was moving. I watched from my apartment as messages online shifted tone. Comments were deleted. Announcements postponed. The story began to fracture under its own weight. I still hadn't spoken to my husband. When he finally called, his voice was unsteady. He asked why I was doing this. I told him I wasn't doing anything. I was responding. That was the last conversation we had. I didn't return for the hearing. I didn't need to. By then, everything that mattered was already in motion, and none of it required my presence or my voice. The medical board's inquiry expanded quietly. What began as a review of consent forms widened into an audit of case handling and patient substitution. The clinic issued a neutral statement about administrative irregularities. Investors paused. Partners asked questions. Schedules slipped. My attorney forwarded updates as they came in. Short emails. Clear language. No drama. A senior physician resigned. The clinic's legal team requested a closed-door settlement. We declined. There was no advantage in resolving it privately. The wedding was postponed twice. First for logistics. Then for health reasons. Photos stopped appearing. Accounts went silent. When announcements resumed, the tone had changed. Words like blessing and miracle were replaced with privacy and respect. A week later, a certified letter arrived at my apartment. It was from my former in-law's attorney. They acknowledged errors. They requested a mutual non-disparagement agreement. In exchange, they offered an additional payment and asked that I withdraw my complaint. I didn't respond. Instead, my attorney filed a supplemental exhibit. It included the letter, timestamped and logged. It showed that even now, they were trying to negotiate outcomes rather than address causes. The inquiry concluded with findings. The clinic was fined. Licensing conditions were imposed. The use of my patient profile without consent was formally documented. The lab corrected its records. The case number was reassigned. None of this made headlines. It didn't need to. Systems don't require spectacle to enforce consequences. They just need records. Months later, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that the family had sold property to cover legal exposure. The investors withdrew. The narrative they'd built couldn't survive verification. It collapsed under cross-checks and signatures. I closed my old email account. I changed my number. I moved apartments once more, not out of fear, but because I wanted a view of the water instead of the street. Sometimes I thought about the check they'd given me at that restaurant. How easily they believed it would end everything. I hadn't spent most of it. I donated part. I invested the rest quietly. It was never leverage. It was just a receipt. I didn't reconcile with my husband. There was nothing left to clarify. His silence answered every question I might have asked. The country I lived in became home without ceremony. I built routines. I made friends who knew nothing about my past and didn't need to. When people asked about my marriage, I said it ended. That was enough. I never confronted his family. I never sent a final message. I let the filing speak. I let the dates line up. I let the truth move at its own pace. In the end, I didn't vanish. I just stepped out of their story and let them face the one they'd written themselves.